Demographically speaking, their labor costs have gone up now by a factor of 16 since 2020. They're no longer the low-cost producer of anything. The demographic situation is now so atrocious that they're literally running out of people aged 40 to be in the factories in the first place. And that's before you consider perhaps an energy shock because of the Ukraine war or a trade shock because of tensions with the United States. We're going to lose them, and we are not ready for that. Central bank digital currencies mean something different to everyone, and in the most extreme version, which is what the Chinese are trying to implement, some version of what you just outlined actually is the express government goal, the ability to monitor in real time every transaction everywhere. But keep in mind the very big difference between the American system and the Chinese system. The American Federal Reserve is just a few hundred people, and they have no interest in monitoring transactions, and they have no capacity without at least 100-fold expansion in their staff. China has 1.3 billion people, and government control of everyone's daily life is the first and foremost goal of the Chinese Communist Party. So for one of these governments, a digital currency is expressly designed to do exactly what you said, and in the other case, with the Federal Reserve isn't even sure it wants one. The Federal Reserve is poking at it, but it doesn't at the moment see a very strong use case for an independent digital currency. Now, if you talk about a digital currency as what the Fed is actually doing, which is just basically making all transactions that want to be digital, and you use paper to cash as rarely as possible, and everything is cleared on your phone, then yes, the Federal Reserve is going that direction, but the United Kingdom is already there because the United Kingdom basically got rid of paper checks. So there's a natural evolution here in the financial system that the Fed is embracing. But what most people talk about when they're talking about CDBs is really not what the Western world is even exploring, much less has an interest in. Well, let me give you four. The first one, and by far the most significant, is the demographic collapse. As countries industrialize, they move into the cities and birth rate drops. And the same time that happened in China, starting in the late 1970s, the Chinese also instituted the one-child policy. So you had economic trends crashing the birth rate at the same time as the government forced it down even further. And now in major cities across China, the number of births per woman is below 0.8, which is a historical low for any country in any era. And we're looking at a complete loss of the working class in China in under a decade. And there's not an economic model that works with that at all. There's no negotiating on that one. You can't fix that. Second big problem is that Chairman Xi has executed or exiled or imprisoned everyone within the PRC who's capable of independent thought, and no one wants to bring him information anymore. So if you were going to attempt to have a more dynamic system that thinks forward, thinks ahead, they don't have that anymore. They may have had it at one point, we can debate that, but it's gone now. And you basically have one guy making policy in a box and everyone afraid to tell him anything because they don't want to be the next messenger that's shot. That's not a great thing to do when your country is facing critical problems. Number three, the financial sector. When the United States got into trouble in 2008 with subprime, we had doubled total private credit in 8 years. That was too much too fast. China has increased their credit by a factor of 34 in 20 years. There is no country in history that has gone up this far, this fast, ever, and survived doing 1/3 of that volume. So you want to talk about a financial crisis, it will be centered in the People's Republic, and the economic sector that is most exposed in China is agriculture. So not only do you have an industrial bust to go with the financial bust, you might even have famine. And that brings us to the fourth thing. China imports 3/4 of their energy. 3/4 of that comes from the Persian Gulf or further beyond. And they import over 3/4 of the inputs that are required for them to grow their own food. They are the country most dependent upon international trade simply to exist. And whether it's the Ukraine war or spat in the Persian Gulf, or the Americans going on the warpath, or simply internal political incompetence, which is now rising every day, this doesn't work, not in a non-globalized system. So China is going to flame out just as impressively as it flamed on. And we're all going to remember it for a good long time. The Inflation Reduction Act, which is a dumb name for what it actually does, seeks to build out processing capacity for a lot of the technologies and especially a lot of the base materials that are required in order to do the green transition. Now, I'm a green, but I'm a green that tends to get uninvited to parties because I can actually do math. And I call people when they're saying bullshit. In the case of what's going on with the Biden administration, though, we are the sunniest first world country after Australia, and we are the windiest first world country. So there is a lot of room in the United States in an economically viable manner to expand our green tech footprint and splice it in with everything else we do. Now, there's 1,000 caveats in that statement about the wheres and the whens and the hows and the how fasts. I think that's a good starting point. The weak point in the American green tech industry is we produce almost none of the base materials and even less of the processed materials. So once the lithium is basically mined and concentrated, it then needs to be turned into lithium metal. That processing step from the powder to the metal, none of that's done here. Very little of the copper harnesses are done. Almost no of the nickel processing is done here, and on and on and on and on. And if I'm right about China, we're going to lose the location that does most of the processing. And guess what the country is in the world that does the second most processing? Russia. So the idea that there's a few $100 billion floating around in the American system to chase after industry to do this at scale in North America, I think is a grand idea. Once you get out of the weeds, you will find things you don't like. But overall, remember, this is the first industrial policy the United States has had since the 1940s. The advantage we have on the American president right now is that he was a full grown-ass man in the 1940s. He remembers how that went. He's the only person alive right now who does. And so it makes sense that he's the first person to come up with an industrial policy since then. Oh my God, I wish I had a good one for you. What I can tell you is that most Russian crude, about 70%, is produced in the permafrost. And because the Russian demographic is terminal, and because the Russian educational system collapsed 30 years ago, there's only a very small cadre of skilled workers that are actually trained up to do the work in the permafrost. And they're on average in their late 50s now. So there's not a lot of them. They're literally dying out. And without Western tech and above all else, Western workers, the ability of the Russians to keep this stuff flowing is very much called into question. And that's before you consider war, sanctions, or boycotts, all of which are having their own impact. So we need to plan for a not too distant future when Russian crude exports just aren't there. Now, in that scenario, especially if it happens suddenly, we're going to have a significant price shock around the world. And then you have to look to Washington. Because in Washington, the American president has the authority to end oil exports with the stroke of a pen. It doesn't have to go to Congress. That authority was already granted back in 2015. And since Biden is the most economically populist president we've ever had, there is no way he is going to expose the American consumer, the American voter, to high and volatile global prices if he doesn't have to. So the question just isn't when will the Russian stuff go offline. It's how much American stuff goes on offline with it. And if the world loses American and Russian crude at the same time, you're probably looking at crude prices never dropping below 150 again. And you're probably looking at a captured price in North America where they never rise above 70 again. Probably. There's a lot of ifs and statements leads to that prediction. Well, any sector you're going to be able to find companies that are in problems. The one I am by far the most concerned about on a global basis is America's Apple. Starting with what's going on in the tech sector, the pace of technological advance is going to slow considerably. And if Apple can no longer release a new version every 6 months, that's obviously going to hit their bottom line. But more importantly, roughly 90% of the supply chain steps that go into the average iPhone touch the People's Republic of China in some way. Now, a lot of that is going to be more on the low value add and assembly, but that's not nothing either. And without the Chinese as part of the supply system, it's going to take Apple at least 5 years to rebuild that supply chain capacity in other parts of the world. Now, most companies, I would say that would be the kiss of death. But this is Apple, and they've got a giant cash cow, and they've got a giant war chest, so they can afford to do that. But it's going to take them a lot of time. Well, again, green that can do math. And as a rule, I would say most EVs don't make it. If you believe Tesla, You can break even on your carbon debt in a matter of a couple of years, and maybe even economically a few after that. The problem is that Tesla data assumes that your that your electric vehicle was fabricated with 100% green energy and is fueled by 100% green energy, and that is just not the case. Most of the processing and most of the middle steps in manufacturing are powered by soft brown coal in China. And then even in California, only half of the grid is green. And then, of course, this might be a shock to some people, people are relying more on solar than wind in most places. But there has never been a day where the wind shines at night, which is when most people are going to be recharging their cars. So even if you've got a reasonably clean grid, you're still probably charging your car with fossil fuel energy. So that story probably isn't there yet. The technology may evolve, and if the technology evolves, I reserve the right to change my mind. But today, no. In addition, if we're serious about doing this with the technology we have today, then the build-out needs a lot more power plants for solar and wind, a lot more transmission, a huge number of battery systems to replace all those peaker plants, in addition to electrifying transport. That means we need 3 times as much copper, 10 times as much nickel, 18 times as much graphite, 12 times as much lithium, and on and on and on. And we need it all by 2030. There has never been a decade in human history where we've been using an industrial material and we've doubled its availability in a 10-year period. And now we have to do that and more for 11 different materials? No, cannot do it. So what's going to happen this decade is there's going to be a bit of a come to Jesus moment within the green community when they realize that the dreams cannot match the realities. And that means one of 2 things will have to happen. Number one, the dream will have to change to something that's more realistic. Or the one country with the military capacity to do it goes out and secures the sources of these materials for themselves. Because while the world couldn't do the green transition with today's tech, the United States might be able to. But that means taking all of those things off the global market. Well, I'm not a financial guy, so take that for what it is, or take what I'm about to say for what it is. We're going through quite a churn right now as the baby boomers are removed from the system. We've had an environment of extraordinarily cheap capital that has lasted an extraordinarily long time, and there's just going to be a lot of shakeout. There's no way around that. We're all going to have to get used to a new operating environment. But if you fast forward just 2 or 3 years when the vast majority of that money is gone, anyone who still has capital to deploy in that environment will discover that there's not a lot of competition in capital holders because the next generation, Gen X, is so much smaller. So you should expect the rate of returns 3 years from now to be significantly better on average than anything we've seen in the last 20 years, which means that financial planners will actually have to do their job and have to look for things that are companies that bring value and that aren't just being manipulated by cheap capital. For the investor, this is about to get a lot easier. For the investment professional, it's about to get a lot more competitive. Well, it's kind of funny because sometimes people have labeled me as the America's greatest purveyor of doom porn. So it's difficult to remain too cheery, but a couple of things. Number one, we are going through a period of extreme change. And yes, that means a lot of dislocation and destruction. But this isn't the end of the human condition. This isn't the end of America or Australia, maybe the end of China. And so we know we will get through this. Our systems are stable. Our demographics are pretty good. Our finances are about as good as you can get. We will get through this. And in the case of the United States, if we're really losing access to materials processing and manufacturing out of both China and Germany at more or less the same time, that means here in North America, we need to double the size of the industrial plant. And yes, that means inflation will be high for a good long time. But it's also going to be the greatest growth story in the history of my country and Mexico and Canada. And on the backside of this, we will have built a supply chain system that uses less workers, is more capital efficient, is more energy efficient, that employs locals to serve local markets, that's cleaner, that's more responsible, and it'll be largely resistant to international shocks. This is a good story. We just have to get from here to there.